So, hello everyone. Get to another conversation from the platform of Untold Diaries. Today, we are very fortunate, and I am personally very excited to have a very dear friend over from Madrid who will be talking to us about the current situation in Gaza and Israel and the conflict related over Palestine. And my friend who happens to be a professor in architectural history and thought. His name is Daniel Mielgo. But in the interest of time, I will let Daniel introduce his professional and educational journey and his interest in the area. So over to you, Daniel.
Yes, thank you for having me, Bina. As you said, my name is Daniel Mielgo. I am a graduate in architecture and a teacher in architectural theory and history. I've also done extensive research in architectural issues and also in the Middle East, where I've visited the area, of course, and I've had a keen interest in this conflict for a while. So I guess my interest in this stems from way back, and I've been looking into this conflict for some time from the point of view of a Spaniard, really, because I do think that our interest in this topic should relate to our political relation towards the conflict. Americans should approach this issue as American citizens, Israelis as Israelis, and so on. I happen to think of it in terms of European citizens, since the European Union happens to have a degree of responsibility in what's happening and in what's been happening for a long time. And that's basically where my interest in this issue comes from. Now, as for the current situation in Gaza, I think it's worthwhile contextualizing what happened on the 6th of October, because the mainstream narrative in the media about this incident or these crimes, and there's no doubt that there were very significant crimes that occurred on the 6th of October in Israeli territory. The current narrative, as I said, was to set the clock from that day onwards, as if this happened in a vacuum. I have actually with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who said at a Security Council meeting that these events did not happen in a vacuum. So without providing a lot of history about the Gaza Strip, and we know, your listeners should know that the Gaza Strip was a creation of the State of Israel, really. It was, prior to 1948, a rather prosperous Palestinian area, lovely beaches, so rather functional economy, actually, and it's difficult to imagine it these days, but it was a rather idyllic location for many Palestinian families. With the war of 1948, there were approximately 300,000 refugees from villages that had been taken over and destroyed by the nascent Israeli state that ended up in what's now the Gaza Strip. That accounts for the fact that of today's population in Gaza, which is approximately 2.3 million people, 70% of those people are either refugees or descendants of refugees. Over 50% of the population are children, that's to say boys and girls under the age of 16. Approximately 80% of the population of Gaza prior to the 7th of October depends on humanitarian aid for their basic survival. The unemployment rate is over 50% overall, and that amounts to approximately 60 to 65% for young people. I suppose the main background to the 7th events, leaving aside the creation of the Gaza Strip from 1948, and then Israel started colonizing or building small settlements in comparison to what it was doing elsewhere, but there were no less illegal Israeli settlements after the Six-Day War in June of 1967. Jewish settlements, Israeli settlements there began in 1969. But it was really in 2005, I think, where the current situation in Gaza began to be extremely dramatic. Some of your listeners may recall that year, the then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced, with a few years before actually, but it implemented the so-called withdrawal from Gaza. That's to say that the Israeli settlements there were dismantled and the Israeli military withdrew from Gazan territory. It's interesting to point out what the purpose of that was in the context of the Israeli occupation. Every Israeli observer and knowledgeable people on this conflict knew straight away that the withdrawal was basically an expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank. In fact, on the very same day that Ariel Sharon announced the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, approved thousands of new building licenses in the West Bank. So it made no sense from an Israeli point of view to preserve some 5,000 to 7,000 settlers in Gaza, where it could expand very easily into the West Bank in areas that were far more interesting to them. As Ariel Sharon himself said, the withdrawal from Gaza by Israel was, and I'm quoting him now, vital for the assurance of lands that are vital for Israel's existence. Those were Ariel Sharon's words. And it's no wonder that the withdrawal of Gaza was announced, planned, and executed in conjunction with the so-called separation barrier that Israel had been building for a while and is still building in the West Bank. Also worth reminding your listeners is the fact that in the summer of 2004, the International Court of Justice considered a case brought forward by the Palestinian Authority condemning this wall, and the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of the Palestinian Authority. It condemned the wall as a de facto annexation of occupied Palestinian territory, and that's approximately 80% of the course of the wall. Anybody who's seen the wall in East Jerusalem, for example, can very clearly see what the court meant by that resolution. And needless to say as well, of course, that the Israeli government and the Israeli state at large dismissed the court judgments with total contempt, and the wall is still there. So anyway, back to the withdrawal in 2005. The next relevant event leading up to the current situation was January of 2006. And at that time, there was a free election held in Palestine, in the occupied territories and in the Gaza Strip. And the contestants to that election, the main two contestants really, were the ruling party of the current Palestinian Authority, PLO, that's to say Fatah, and Hamas. Hamas, I should say, is a national liberation organization that emerged in the late 80s, actually in 1987, supported at the time by Israel. Israel bankrolled Hamas for a very long time until it committed the major crime of winning an election in January of 2006. That's when all the alarm bells went off, and the international community, of course, reacted with panic because the wrong people had won the election. There's no doubt whatsoever that the election was fair. It was monitored very carefully by international observers, among them ex-US President Jimmy Carter, who wrote a report on the elections, considering them a clean and fair election, and Hamas had won hands down. Well, after that, Israel stepped up the tension by introducing a massive blockade of the Gaza Strip, cutting off supplies, delivery of food, water, and so on was severely restricted. Hamas lived up to a kind of ceasefire. There were a few skirmishes in the border, as usual. But it's worth reminding your viewers that the logic has been the same ever since 2006. Israel incites a certain level of provocation, which elicits Hamas response, like, for example, firing rockets into Israeli territory. And that, in turn, allows Israel, or it provides the necessary pretext to carry out a larger military operation of collective punishment, really. Well, Israel began with several operations. They give biblical names to these routine operations, which in Israel received the name of mowing the lawn. That's to say, we have to teach Palestinians that they cannot raise their heads, literally. So, for example, the first operation was in the year of 2006. It was called First Rains. Then there was another military operation called Autumn Rains. and so on. The first major military operation at a large scale, which attracted a lot of international attention, was in December of 2008. You remember that there was an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was captured by Hamas in the border of Gaza. The previous day, I should say, Israel had kidnapped two Hamas members in the West Bank. So the capture of Shalit, who was an Israeli soldier, in occupied territory, because I should say in parentheses that Gaza, despite Israel's withdrawal in 2005, continues to be under international law an occupied Palestinian territory. That's the opinion of the international community at large, including the International Red Cross. It continues to be the occupying power because Israel controls the airspace over Gaza. It has total control over the waters, and it has control over the land barriers and frontiers of Gaza. And it's created a so-called security buffer prior to October 7th, created a security buffer within the land of Gaza, where it has military outposts to control human traffic to and from Gaza. So it is the occupying power. So it means that the capture of an Israeli soldier is not as worse a crime as the capture of two civilians, as Israel did the previous day.
Yeah.
But just to contextualize this a little bit, Bina, and a lot happens in Gaza that we hardly know about outside of Israel and other media. But Israel responded, of course, by launching Operation Cast Lead. That was launched on the 27th of December of 2008, taking advantage of the fact that at that time in the US there was a kind of window of opportunity because, if you remember, Barack Obama had just won the election and the change of administration was undergoing in Washington. And it finished, I mean, it took willful blindness not to see it, but it stopped right before Obama's being sworn into office in January, in the 17th of January, a few days before Obama took office. That operation was a hideous operation, which resulted in 1,400 Palestinians killed, approximately, use of banned weapons and so on. Just to give your viewers an example, Amnesty International published a lengthy report called 22 Days of Death and Destruction. So that was Operation Cast Lead. And just to cut a long story short, ever since then, Israel has been carrying out these routine operations of mowing the lawn. The next one was Pillar of Defense, again in 2012. Then there was the Great March of Return in 2018, where Israel gunned down peaceful protesters marching to the border of Gaza. Prior to that, in 2014, there'd be a Protective Edge, another hideous operation which resulted in over 2,000 Palestinians killed and so on. And the blockade of Gaza has been increased, was increased to an enormous extent, to the extent that, as I said earlier, 80% of its population depends directly on humanitarian aid, among much else, of course. But Gaza is really a torture chamber for its 2.3 million people. They can be considered hostages, in fact. And what took place on October 7th was basically an uprising. It's worthwhile to consider it as an uprising. This is by no means to condone what Hamas did that day. By the way, it's not very clear what happened, incidentally. If you take a look at Israeli media and newspapers, they've progressively been bumping down the figure of 1,400 killed that was announced initially. But we know for certain that among the dead, most of them, the overwhelming majority actually, were military personnel. There were civilians killed, of course. There were atrocities committed. And it's pretty clear by now, as being conceded by several Israeli newspapers, among them Haaretz, which is probably the most reputable one, that a lot of the damage committed on the 7th of October was created by Israeli military forces and Apache helicopters, US-made Apache helicopters that fired down Israeli civilians in the attempt to retaliate. So the events of the 7th of October are by no means clear. But what is clear is that it was used by Israel, certainly, as a pretext to carry out what is going on right now. And it was obviously an operation that was well planned in advance. This has not been improvised by the Israeli military.
Daniel, thank you for that very interesting and a very in-depth and an insightful context into the situation. You've given us a very in-depth historical context to the whole situation, and I think couldn't have been better for our listeners and for myself even to understand the context. However, in spite of all this, in spite of all that you've put down there, the facts, the references, how would you say or explain, or to what extent can you say with 100% confidence that Hamas is a US-Israel creation?
I wouldn't say they are a creation of the United States and Israel. Hamas, as I said, was born out of the first Intifada in 1987.
That's right.
And it was a movement of national, and it continues to be a movement of national liberation. The only difference between, well, there are many differences actually between Hamas and Fatah. One of the major differences is that it is not a secular movement of national liberation. So obviously there is a religious element to Hamas that Fatah at least does not uphold. But beyond that, I think Hamas, here I'm using references of Western observers that have looked into this matter very closely. And I suppose the prime authority for this is a Harvard professor called Sarah Roy, who for a long time has been studying the activities of Hamas. Hamas have done a lot of things for the Palestinian people in a very, very difficult context, in the context of occupation. They have formed charities, social support groups. They have been responsible for paying teachers' salaries. They have set up clinics, aid centers. They've set up cooperatives. So, with some justification, or a lot of it actually, many Palestinians voted for Hamas because they saw a political movement which was deeply committed to the cause of the Palestinian people, more so than Fatah and the PLO, which were, well, their reputation among Palestinians had been decimated for decades of corruption and mismanagement. So the victory of Hamas in 2006 is very justifiable. It is explainable, and it can be explained by facts on the ground. And that continued to be the case until now. Hamas is not a terrorist organization, as the United States, the European Union, Israel, and Britain are bent on portraying. You see, when we describe Hamas as a terrorist organization, we have to understand that that label acts as a doctrinal slogan in order to cancel any analysis of what Hamas is. Once you refer to a group as a terrorist organization, that's it in the media. There's no room for discussion, no inquiry as to its grievances, or no inquiry as to why it does what it does. And it's, of course, true that Hamas has committed and is responsible for acts of terrorism. Who isn't in this context? Everybody is. But it's way more than a terrorist organization. I certainly think that it helps in no way at all to dispatch Hamas as a terrorist organization. It's way more than that.
So you at this stage are definitely not calling Hamas a terrorist organization. And from what it seems, from from what you've been telling us about the context, that in a way, living in this part of the world, Hamas has evolved into. So, what is the current entity of Hamas? If it's not a terrorist organization, and you're also saying it's now leaning more towards the extremist mindset, the Islamic mindset, it's something what we experienced here sitting in our part of the world when the Russians were here and the Mujahideens were created with the help of the Americans to fight the Russians, with the help of the Pakistani army and the Pakistanis. Mujahideens then became West's heroes, and eventually their children, Taliban, the disbanded Taliban once the West decided when the Russians were out. So there was this interesting transformation, identity transformation of a particular group from being the saviors to terrorists eventually. So
well, I think,
are you saying that Hamas has gone through a similar trajectory of identity transformation?
No, I don't think so. I think, to be fair, the comparison between Hamas and other groups, not to speak of the Mujahideen, is unhelpful. They have nothing to do with the Mujahideen, certainly nothing whatsoever to do with ISIS,
They've
no matter
compared
how
them
much
to
it's been.
ISIS, right? The West has compared
Uh,
them to ISIS. The West
yeah,
has compared them with ISIS, right?
yeah, as I said before, the comparison is totally unwarranted, and it's a form of cancelling any discussion or analysis or understanding, for that matter, of what Hamas is. Hamas is not ISIS. They have absolutely nothing to do with ISIS. Um, Hamas is a movement of national liberation. We have to understand that. It's a movement of national liberation, but it's a non secular movement. And it started off as such, and it's continued to be a movement of national liberation. It's often said that Hamas is bent on the destruction of Israel. And it's true that the charter of Hamas has a statement that Israel should disappear, or words to that effect. Firstly, that charter was written in the context of the First Intifada by a few clerics. It has really very little status in the current activities of Hamas. Incidentally, if we're looking at charters, we should look at the charter of the current ruling party in Israel, Likud, or at least its
Yes,
president, which
yes.
is Herut.
Tell us something
And
about that. Yeah.
their charter states that they're the originators actually of the phrase "from the river to the sea." And that's to say that from their point of view, Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, should stretch from the bank of the River Jordan to the Mediterranean.
Yes,
That includes the entirety of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That was actually assumed by Netanyahu's last address in the United Nations General Assembly, where he showed a map of the Middle East with no Palestine on it, just one blank space called Israel. So if we're talking about charters, then there's many people in Israel that believe that Palestine should not exist at all. But
yes,
leaving that to one side, what's most interesting for the current conflict, and one of the main reasons behind what's happening and what's been happening in Gaza ever since 2006, is that Hamas has repeatedly insisted on its willingness and its disposition to engage in negotiations with Israel for a peaceful settlement of the conflict based on the 1967 borders, which is the overwhelming international consensus and has been the overwhelming international consensus for close to 50 years. That is actually backed by the United Nations General Assembly year after year on resolutions with almost unanimous agreement, with the exception of the United States and Israel. I mean, your listeners shouldn't pay attention to me. All they need to do is to check the voting records for the peaceful resolution to the question of Palestine, which year after year the UN passes in its General Assembly. Now, the United Nations for over 50 years has been unilaterally blocking this settlement in one way or another, both in the UN Security Council and in other initiatives that have been put forward. But as for Hamas, they've clearly shown their dispositions to engage in negotiations based on that premise, the 1967 borders. Of course, that's not reported over here because, and in the West generally, because it's far more convenient to portray Hamas as a terrorist organization bent on the destruction of Israel. Anybody who believes that, even assuming the narrative, that anybody who believes that an organization like Hamas would have the capability of destroying one of the most sophisticated armies in the world, like the Israeli army, is simply not living in the real world, I'm afraid. Even if Hamas was bent on that, which it isn't, they wouldn't even, they wouldn't even exist. They'd be pulverized immediately. So it's a narrative that it's very convenient for justifying whatever Israel happens to be doing. So the argument of self-defense that's daily invoked by the Israeli authorities and its apologists really stands no scrutiny, I'm afraid.
yeah, yeah. So, Daniel, I mean, another interesting scenario that is emerging this time round in this conflict is that there's extreme polarization, not only between the Islamic versus non-Islamic countries, but even within the West itself. The Western civil society, as take a case in point, Harvard and other Ivy League universities, look at the big demonstrations that came out in London, Washington, Sydney, and other Western capitals, and I'm sure in Madrid also. So
Yes,
that is a very interesting, development.
yes, it is.
How do you perceive that? How would you interpret that? And do you think it's
I
going
do
to
think
stop? It's just a response or a reaction, or do you think this is going to be something which will change the narrative to an extent?
I'm not sure it will change the narrative that much, at least for the time being. But I agree with you that it is probably the only hopeful development in what is going on. The scale of protests and solidarity with the Palestinian cause across the world has very rarely seen this scale.
Yes.
You mentioned Harvard just a moment ago, which is a case that I know quite well. I happen to have been a researcher at that university in the year 2008, 2009, when Israel launched its Operation Cast Lead, to which I referred earlier. At the time, I remember perfectly well, you could literally count with the fingers of both hands the number of people that were protesting on campus. I was one of them, and it was a bit embarrassing, to be honest with you, because there were hardly anybody. There was hardly anybody paying any attention to us, and we were a bit of a laughing stock. Now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Harvard students protesting. And in fact, the Israeli so-called lobby or Israeli apologists have been so concerned by this that they've decided to stage some kind of congress in the States from Ivy League representatives who are actually claiming what a horrifying experience it is to be an Israeli in US university because they feel besieged. They feel besieged by Palestine supporters, which is, of course, a complete fabrication. But yes, I mean, there is a great deal of protest going on in the States. There's a great deal of social awareness that's been mobilizing. And that is a sign of hope, because if the US administration can be pushed to change its policy, this time at least the damage can be ameliorated. And in the future, who knows? Continuing activism may force the US government, whatever it is, or the United States generally, to change its policy towards Israel. But I'm afraid that nothing will change if things don't change in the United States. It is so polarized, as you said, and so one sided that really the rest of the international community can do very little if things don't change in the US. That's really the main source of decision making power in this conflict, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. That sort of, yeah, and I think it's still as the situation is unfolding, it's I think that dynamics and the calculus of power is changing. However, since I was referring to some of your notes, so when you call it as the willful creation of the second Nakba, can you elaborate a little on that?
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that what's been going on in Gaza since the 7th of October has already surpassed the scale of the first Nakba. Remember when
Yes.
over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homes in the former Palestine,
Yeah.
and they were not allowed to return. That is really the smoking gun of an ethnic cleansing. It's not just the expulsion of a population, it's the incapacity of that population to return. So the fact that Israel has never allowed them to return is really what confirms an ethnic cleansing. Over 1 million people, 1.2 million people, were forcefully displaced since early October into southern Gaza. They are now in what used to be one of the most densely populated areas, if not the most densely populated area in the world. Now it's doubled that number of people in southern Gaza. So the conditions there are frankly unimaginable. And 80% of the infrastructure in northern Gaza and in the city of Gaza has already been destroyed. The population has been displaced. So there's no doubt that the intention is pretty willful. The intention of this massive destruction is to leave nothing for the Palestinians to return to. And in fact, during the short ceasefire, or this rather obscene expression that the the international community used, humanitarian pause, which was basically a pause in the slaughter, Netanyahu visited the destroyed northern Gaza area, and he said, as was reported in the Israeli press and in other media like Al Jazeera, today we lay the first stone of what will become the further land of Israel. So there's no doubt that the Israeli military will occupy northern Gaza. What will happen with the remaining 2.2 or 2.3 million people that are now confined in even much worse conditions in southern Gaza, we don't really know. What Israel intends to do with them is anybody's guess. They may want to leave them there with the intention of making their lives so unbearable that they will willfully leave southern Gaza into Egypt, probably. There's discussion of Arab countries taking a quota of Palestinian refugees, like they did back in 1948 and 1967. But to be honest with you, that is a despicable argument in itself. I mean, the same argument could be applied to
What's
Israelis.
your prognosis on that? Do you think they will be taking in refugees? Where we stand
Uh,
today, do you think that there is any inclination? I think some countries like Egypt and even Jordan again have mentioned, are we willing
I
to?
think that there's no intention whatsoever from any of the Arab countries to take in Palestinian refugees. And to be honest with you, they have a point. They do have a point. I'm not a friend of the Egyptian military junta that rules Egypt, but they do have a point. Their argument is, well, why should we take in refugees? This is Israel's creation. This is Israel's responsibility. Furthermore, refugees under occupied territory are the civil responsibility of the occupying army. Israel has no right whatsoever to do any of this. It doesn't have any right to lay a finger upon Gaza, let alone to do what it's doing. So why should other nations be left to clean up the mess? And furthermore, if we agree taking up refugees to make room for Israel in occupied Gaza, why shouldn't we apply the same argument to Israelis?
Yep.
That's to say, so in the port of Eilat, for instance, many thousands of, well, 2.2 million Israelis could leave the land of Israel. They could go to New York, for example, or Paris, many Jewish communities in France or elsewhere, and make room for Palestinians.